Many people are probably familiar with the old Russian proverb, "He who remembers the past will lose an eye," though to what extent is another question. Fewer viewers know its full version, which radically changes the meaning of this folk wisdom. He who remembers the past will lose an eye, but he who forgets it will lose both. Something similar has been happening for many decades with the way Soviet-Finnish relations have been presented, first to the citizens of the entire USSR, and after the collapse of the great country, to the nations that emerged in its place. This is perhaps the most refined example of the first version of the aforementioned folk wisdom, which usually did not reach such an extreme degree of historical forgetfulness, even in relation to the peoples most friendly to us. Take the East Germans, for example. They have been, at least since the mid-1950s, the most loyal allies of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact. But that didn't get in the way at all of the broad state-supported focus in our country on the topic of the Great Patriotic War, during which the Germans were portrayed as they really were, bloody and ruthless invaders, deserving only one fate: destruction if they refused to surrender. Even after the victory, Nazi political officers were often portrayed in war films not just as cruel, but also as clever. That made it all the more honorable to be proud of defeating intelligent enemies, not just clinical idiots. In the history of Soviet-Finnish relations, there was what you might call complete calm and tranquility. Of course, the War of 1939 to 1940, as well as the participation of the Finnish army fighting on Hitler's side, did get a few lines in textbooks, even school ones after all. Unlike, by the way, today's textbooks. But when it came to the arts, especially cinema, there was an almost unanimous vow of silence regarding any noticeable negativity on this topic. A vivid example of this can be seen in the most famous films made by Soviet filmmakers, sometimes in collaboration to varying degrees with their Finnish colleagues. For example, Sveaborg, about the uprising of the Russian fortress garrison near Helsingfors, which is the modern capital of Finland, Helsinki, in July 1906. Yes, it was supported by units of the Finnish Red Guard, whose successors, in turn, were partly driven out and partly crushed by the White Finns. In 1918, they established their total bourgeois dictatorship there. But that happened later. There's no need to remind anyone about that, right? About the immediate prelude to the defeat of Soviet power in Finland. In 1975, another film called Trust was made, telling the story of how, on the very last day of the old 1917, the Council of People's Commissars, chaired by Lenin, granted independence to the former Grand Duchy of Finland. And notably, this was not to the representatives of the Finnish Soviets, workers and peasants, but to the well-heeled bourgeoisie, the owners of factories, newspapers, and steamships, whose accomplices, just a few weeks later, they unleashed a bloody terror in the newly formed country against anyone who happened to fall into their hands. Not just against the Reds, but even against ordinary Russians, as happened during the infamous Vyborg massacre. Alas, neither this massacre nor the wars of 1921 to 1922, 1939 to 1940, and 1941 to 1944 are given a single frame in that film. The situation in 1917, as described in the film, was dictated not by some kind of Leninist malice or the dogmatic idealism of the Bolshevik leader regarding granting the right to self-determination to all the peoples of the Russian Empire. It's just that the Soviet government, neither then or even a bit later, simply didn't have enough resources, economic or military, to keep these territories under its influence. Not just Finland, but even the Baltics, Western Belarus, and Ukraine. And even the Far East remained under the control of the nominally independent, pink-tinged Far Eastern Republic until 1922. Be that as it may, trying to gloss over Finland's outright hostility toward the USSR from the very moment it gained independence, up until its defeat in the war in 1944, starts to sound more like a fairy tale than a realistic, historical approach. Well, in its own way, it did have certain reasons. The notorious Finnish model of relations with the USSR, better known by the foreign press term Finlandization. In short, it meant maintaining formal independence, provided there were close economic and political ties, and most importantly, a friendly neutrality toward Moscow. And overall, this model was actually quite stable, at least until the collapse of the USSR, which caused a break in economic ties. The loss of markets for a significant part of Finnish industry and agriculture led, accordingly, to the search for new strategic partners, who, as you can easily guess, turned out to be, well, guess who? The friendly family that Helsinki joined at record speed in 2022. This was immediately commented on by various not yet identified foreign agents in the spirit of, "We scared our poor neighbors, so they rushed to extremes. It's fine. Things will settle down later." The question is, why be surprised? It's no coincidence that in June 2016, the scandalously infamous memorial plaque was installed for the executioner of Leningrad and Soviet Karelia, Marshal Mannerheim. And not without the involvement of homegrown monarchists and singers of the so-called Blast Russia we lost. With its tambolas, champagne, lackeys, cadets, and the ever-present bun crunch. Moreover, instead of being quickly sent to the dump, this plaque hung relatively undisturbed for a good 3 months on the wall of a building in the very city that this leader of Finnish fascism dreamed of razing to the ground, and only then was it dismantled after a wave of public outrage that had become impossible to ignore across the country. Apparently, even that was too short a time. It was hard for citizens, whose perception of their northern neighbors was shaped by movies about kinship and the peculiarities of national hunting, to figure out who was who. In the pantheon of their great national leaders. By the way, no one ever threw that plaque away. It's still in Leningrad to this day. It's hanging in a little museum and is under protection. And even before all the events of February 2022 began, the wave raised by the monument to the Finnish marshal and executioner started to reveal more and more unsavory aspects of both Mannerheim's activities and those of his accomplices. A lot also became clear about the mentality of their descendants today. Bourgeois war criminals. For example, in 2020, the investigative committee opened a criminal case on charges of genocide regarding the creation by Finnish occupiers. In 1941, 14 concentration camps were set up in Karelia, where the entire local Russian population, 24,000 people, including children, was interned, and 8,000 residents died from the unbearable conditions. But an even more striking example in this regard was the reaction of the Finnish side to the corresponding decisions of the Russian court in the summer of 2024, which recognized the actions of the Finnish occupation authorities in Karelia from 1941 to 1944 as genocide and war crimes. In this context, the comment by the former director of the National Archives of Finland, Jussi Kinnunen, is especially noteworthy. Finland has nothing to hide regarding this historical episode, and all Finnish documents are freely accessible, whereas the Soviet ones are mostly classified. But for some reason, Russia does not use this information from the Finnish archives, and instead makes statements that do not always correspond to reality. For example, the estimated number of casualties is exaggerated by about 2 times, and others have no way to assess what these figures are based on. You can't have thorough discussions about history with a totalitarian state, and it's impossible to take Russia's new claims against Finland seriously. Honestly, this approach is just astonishing in its sheer cynicism. It's not even so much about the fact that, generally speaking, the exact number of thousands of victims killed doesn't really matter for recognizing genocide as genocide. Even Wikipedia states that the exact number of Jews killed in the ghettos and death camps set up by the Nazis is unknown. And it varies significantly depending on the data from different researchers. But that in no way negates the recognition of the Holocaust itself, nor its classification specifically as genocide. Likewise, by the way, it doesn't negate criminal liability, including several years in prison for publicly denying it, at least in Germany. That's why the very subject of Mr. Neuwertov's polemic seems especially cynical. The implication being, how can you have discussions with totalitarian states, that is, those that don't obey American capital, like the Finns themselves? Here, it's important to clarify what is meant by the Finns. In this and the following videos, I am referring to the Finnish bourgeois government. Both the current one and the previous ones. Finnish workers, just so we're clear, have the same interests as Russian, American, Chinese, or Persian workers. Workers have a single set of interests, which are directly opposed to those of the bourgeoisie. But yeah, getting back to the point, you could also ask another question. What are these discussions even about? About the fact that according to this character, supposedly non-totalitarian Finland, all the information about this supposedly non-genocidal, cold-blooded extermination of thousands of Soviet citizens has long been publicly available, and in Russia supposedly it isn't? Yes, the real issue is that this monstrous crime doesn't cause even the slightest sense of guilt among the descendants of those who committed it, only irritation that the number of victims is supposedly exaggerated twofold, but not the fact of these atrocities themselves. After all, even a simple murder, just a few victims, committed by a group of people, when committed by prior agreement according to the criminal codes of most countries, this implies the highest possible punishment under the relevant article. Not to mention when we're talking about mass ethnic cleansings, with the physical extermination of a significant portion of people deemed undesirable by the executors. For some reason, by the way, it's always people of the same persuasion. Yes, communist. That's how it turns out. A coincidence, I guess. Of course, according to UC, after the war ended, the Allies, led by the USSR, established a control commission for Finland, which presented the country with a series of demands, including holding trials for war criminals. And to demand a review of those same events more than 80 years later, you see, is inappropriate. Yeah, and they actually did hold that trial in Helsinki in November 1945 for a whole 8 war criminals. Granted, they really were the highest ranking ones, including the ex-president, the predecessor of the current head of state, and several former prime ministers and ministers as well. But most of them only got sentences of 2 to 5 years. Only ex-president Risto Raiti got 10 years. And even then, he didn't serve the full sentence. These sentences are comparable to what you could get in the USSR for something like petty theft, for example. Not to mention stealing state property. And in fact, only those who got 2-year sentences served their full terms. However, as soon as, following the results of the 1947 Paris Peace Treaty, Finland was freed from the formal supervision of the Allied Control Commission, where Soviet representatives played the leading role, the president, Paasikivi, immediately pardoned all the prisoners. Especially since the Finnish public was outraged that they had been tried in violation of the constitution. Of course, because for the trial, the parliament had to pass a law retroactively. That is, in free and non-totalitarian Finland, it turns out that until September 1945, war crimes were not even considered crimes. One must understand this was in full accordance with the democratic will of the Finnish people, who were also outraged by the crackdown on their elected representatives. Yeah! Just like now, its most honorable representatives, like that same bourgeois Nortova, are outraged by Russia's unfounded claims. But at least the 8 top leaders of Finland actually stood trial, even if in the end they basically got off with just a slap on the wrist. But after all, they weren't the ones personally starving people or forcing them into backbreaking slave labor. With beatings and outright brutal torture, thousands of Soviet prisoners of war and civilians, mostly women and children, were killed, and cities were burned. In Karelia, they destroyed the industry, social, and cultural facilities that had been built during Soviet times. They had lower-level people to carry out those orders. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find any clear data showing that these low-ranking executioners were actually held accountable. Even for researchers who have spent many years studying this issue, like the director of the Karelian Isthmus Military Museum, Bear Irinchev, for example. According to him, very few Finnish war criminals were put on trial, almost all of them escaped punishment. Sadly, it's not hard to believe this statement. For example, it's enough to carefully read a document from the Russian State Archive of Sociopolitical History, a report on the investigation of crimes committed by Finnish war criminals, prepared by the assistant, military prosecutor of the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs Troops B, Rugensky. Especially excerpts from the sample text, at present, these prisoners of war have been returned to Finland. In relation to the 8 Finnish army servicemen mentioned, the investigation was unable to obtain any materials that would supplement the information received from the Finnish army servicemen. The available incriminating materials against these individuals are insufficient to bring them to trial. None whatsoever. A prominent Stalinist enforcer during the time of the Bloody Cheka's absolute rule. And 60, then 80 illegally repressed while still alive. According to the anti-Soviet nonsense from Solzhenitsyn and Yakovlev, it is stated outright that for the conviction of the 8 Finnish punishers, against whom there was testimony from survivors, the victims, there was not enough evidence for prosecution. But in general, In that same document, it is stated precisely that there were only 21 criminals for whom full evidence was obtained, and another 14 for whom partial evidence was found. And what, is anyone really going to believe that this handful of monsters was the entire group responsible for killing more than 20,000 Soviet people, civilians, and prisoners of war? Of course not. It's just that many more of them managed to wisely flee from Soviet territories right before they were liberated by the Red Army. Executioners, they don't fight the enemy, they have other tasks. And then, in September of 44, when the new old leader of Finland, Karl Mannerheim, made peace with the USSR, the Finnish army officially became an ally of the anti-Hitler coalition. And those who ended up in its ranks, without having previously been captured by the Red Army, became prisoners. There were just over 2,500 Finns in total. After that, they effectively received a pardon for the crimes they committed against Soviet citizens during the war. The only ones who actually faced trial were the 8 top officials of the bankrupt fascist regime in Helsinki mentioned above. Obviously, they were the least to blame. As a result, the same military prosecutor Roginski, as well as the rest of the staff from the military justice agencies, the prosecutor's office, and special departments, ended up in the same situation. That includes the famous SMERSH and other similar organizations. Most likely, they were simply given orders from above not to dig too deep, since Finland had been Finlandized. Former enemies had switched sides and become allies. Now they had to be treated more gently. In fact, in the last years of the war, the softer approach was applied not only to the Finns, but also, for example, to the Bulgarians and Romanians. It's just that the latter had enough of their own issues. Soon, pro-Soviet communist regimes came to power, and they themselves did a pretty good job of dealing with at least the most notorious homegrown war criminals. Unlike Finland, which kept its political system dominated by bourgeois parties and politicians, nothing really changed there, and Finnish nationalism. So the centers of pre-war Finnish fascism, which had flourished thanks to Hitler's support, couldn't be completely eradicated after the Finnish army's actual defeat. They were just, as they say, swept under the rug, where they quietly but no less effectively continued to smolder. Until they started to be stirred up again, fanned into flame. Both the local anti-Russian radicals and their American capitalist bourgeois patrons, who in recent years have openly set a course, through these people, to open a new front, whether as an addition or as a replacement for the already open one. To start a new kind of magic. And what can you expect from yet another group of worshippers of the Golden Calf? You can make predictions based on the crimes already committed by their ancestors. Crimes from 80 years ago, about which even back then, in the immediate aftermath, quite a few piercing books were written. Unfortunately, they never gained wide recognition due to the aforementioned higher political considerations. Still, they weren't banned from being read in Soviet libraries, though they weren't very accessible either, given their rather limited print runs. Because those who forget the old lessons will end up making the same mistakes in the future, since crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations.